Great. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference. Today, I'm going to be talking about the psychological concept of melancholia in regards to social transitioning for transmasc individuals. And just as a note, the reason I'm talking about specifically transmasc folks today is because that's sort of the experience that I've been seeing in regards to this topic. My own experience, those around me, and sort of what I've seen online when I was making this sort of conceptual connection. So that's why I've decided on this specific group of folks. I'd also like to note that, of course, any group is not monolithic. This presentation may not resonate with everyone's experiences who consider themselves transmasc, and that's okay. It was just sort of a pattern that I've noticed and something that I wanted to bring attention and awareness to. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a brief introduction of some of the topics and definitions that I'm going to be using today for folks who may not be familiar. And then I'm going to talk about what some of the psychological empirical research has shown about how folks are socially raised as they grow up, depending on how they're perceived in terms of sex and how that might affect their social interactions later on in life after they transition. And then at the end, I'm just going to give some brief recommendations on maybe how we can move forward as a community to support folks who are going through social isolation after transitioning. Okay, so first, I mean, obviously, social transitioning is sort of the act of being comfortable with and being perceived as a member of your preferred gender. And that's often a euphoric and exciting process for a lot of folks who seek gender affirming care. I today wanted to talk about some of the maybe unexpected changes in regards to social transitioning and how that might be able to take a toll on someone's mental health. Specifically, the topics of social isolation and alienation after folks in the broader sort of world may be perceiving you differently. For one example of this, I have a trans life coach who I'm very close with, and he talked about online pretty frequently on how the simple act of before he was transitioning, being able to go into a women's restroom at a bar and sort of the easy compliments and niceties that are present in that space, not being present in a lot of cis male or male dominated spaces in general, and how that wasn't something he was expecting. And that felt very isolating to him to suddenly lose that social connection, essentially, especially if you weren't sort of prepared for that as a result of being perceived differently. And sort of hearing about this experience from other folks who have transitioned, I was connecting it to some of the concepts I was learning in my graduate studies, specifically the psychodynamic or psychoanalytical idea of melancholia. And I'll get into that in the next slide, what exactly that means. But essentially, I felt it was a different, an important phenomenon, rather, to be discussed. And though I'm a graduate student on the cusp of my career, I tried to seek out if there was previous research being done on this topic, and there didn't really seem to be anything within the last few years. So while I cannot, do that research on my own, I felt it necessary to try to gather all of the information I could and raise awareness on the topic in case someone with more resources or the ability to look more into this topic would be able to do so themselves. Okay, so what is the definition of melancholia? It was first defined by Freud, and essentially it's a deeply painful sense of self-rejection and loathing after the loss of something important. And it's important to note that that's different than grief, because grieving, while similarly painful or more so, it's not exactly the same sort of situation. So someone who's grieving might typically grieve over the objective loss or death of a loved one, right? Melancholia is sort of more subjective, so it's much more difficult to pin down and recognize and take steps to move past it, because they're more of an abstract concept. For example, melancholia might relate to the concept of someone treating you differently and you're not quite sure why, or a friend moving away. They're not gone, but your relationship has changed, and it might be difficult for you to identify what exactly about that is upsetting, as opposed to something still upsetting, but more objective, again, like the passing away of a loved one, where you know why you're upset. And then later on, a more modern definition of this, and by modern, I mean late 90s in terms of historical sense, Judith Butler coined specifically gender melancholia. And she defined that as a loss of what could have been due to a compulsory heterosexual society. So in her eyes, this definition related to folks who wanted to be openly queer or openly trans, but could not due to the society they found themselves in or felt that they could not, and the sense of grief and loss that comes with that. The definition that I'm proposing is a little more encompassing than that. Specifically, it again refers to folks who have transitioned, are quite happy about their transition and pleased about the outcome. However, they may still feel socially isolated and alienated in ways that they were not expecting. Okay. And why do I want to talk about this? Again, I feel pretty simple, but to really narrow it down, I wanted an updating definition to sort of, for folks to identify with and be able to talk about their feelings in a more down-to-earth way. This concept is pretty abstract, so kind of like giving examples and speaking about like how it can be related and important to trans folks might give sort of a better idea on how to talk about these experiences and how to better cope with them. And that it's important to note, I'm in no way pathologizing this experience. I'm simply trying to describe it in a way that's tangible. As we all know, trans folk face enough stigma and calls to be labeled as mentally ill. That's not my intention with this. I think a population experiencing upsetting and negative feelings based on a response is a normalized one, and I want to be able to normalize it by providing these definitions. And again, social isolation in general results in increased risk for early mortality. So if this is a more common phenomenon than maybe folks realize, it's important to mention it and provide steps on how maybe it can be relieved in some way. Okay. And in order to do that, I wanted to kind of go into the research on sort of perceived gender and societal expectation. Basically, if someone is perceived as a specific gender or if someone is raised as a specific gender, how are they taught to socialize? And why might that lead to isolation further down the road if they're perceived as a different gender? Okay, so what I found when looking at the empirical research is that folks who are raised to be socialized as sort of men or masculine prefer larger groups of friends that are less intense and less interpersonal. Basically, yeah. And then, I apologize. Folks who are raised to socialize as women prefer intimate, close-knit, and didactic relationships, or at the very least, that's what they've been sort of taught in a Western viewpoint, what is correct for them to do. And then as they grow up, those patterns are kind of cemented in their day-to-day interactions and lives. Sorry. Okay. And then there's, of course, stigma and stereotypes that impact gender and friendship. For example, the quote unquote different genders cannot be just friends. And a lot of these sort of thoughts are pretty mainstream in society. And it's much easier to stick to being close friends with people who seem similar to you because of these stereotypes. So if folks are raised socially, if folks of different genders or perceived genders and sexes are raised differently and then are not given the space to interact and form friendships in which those sort of societal rules can be unlearned, that's going to continue to be a pattern. And then this results in an impasse of sorts in an already difficult situation, especially if somebody is trying to transition out of that experience and meet folks that align more with their gender identity. It's sort of like fitting into a world that you may not have experienced before without a lot of thought from others to share with you that that might be the case. And there's a lot of differences, again, that the empirical research psychology-wise have pointed out about like being raised as a different gender and how you interact socially. For example, another study I found investigated how intimacy and vulnerability is perceived by men and women. And folks who are perceived as men view vulnerability in a conversation as something they do not want to seek out. In fact, they reported that they feel social risk when expressing vulnerability, but particularly when they're talking with somebody else they perceive as a man. That's different, at least in this study, than what women have reported. They seem to welcome and expect vulnerability in conversations with friends. And so this can be a huge disconnect. If somebody is raised, perceived as a girl and are exposed to relationships in which they're allowed to and expected to be vulnerable, sort of transitioning and expressing themselves later in life, and trying to seek out companionship with folks who were raised to avoid vulnerability and to view it as a risk is quite a different experience. And in fact, that person who was raised as a girl and trying to connect with others after they are perceived as masculine, they expect to be able to perhaps to show vulnerability, and that may even be off-putting to others who don't know them. And again, that's not something that's talked about during the process or not talked about super often. So that may be a point of isolation that's confusing. Somebody is trying to find these connections and they're not sure why it's not working. And that can lead to a lot of feelings of isolation and alienation. Okay. And then some other further research really quickly that I found essentially talks about men looking for physical strength, wealth, and potential romantic relationship in regards to friends. So like, who do you know that you could introduce me to? Whereas folks who view themselves as women look for emotional support, intimacy, and access to social news. So a lot of this doesn't match up, right? And again, if somebody isn't super aware of this, it can be really frustrating and quite upsetting to not understand why things aren't clicking. Interestingly, though, I'll get on to the next slide here in the steps forward section because I wanted to talk about this. While male friendships are different and are less intimate, another study I found points out that while this is the case, men report that they still long for intimate and vulnerable friendships. So while it is different between these two groups, mostly because of that social expectation, it's interesting to note that that doesn't seem to be what folks want. They've just been socialized to view friendships and intimacy as very different. So if we can bridge that gap and connect sort of as we move forward, that vulnerability and emotional expression in friendships is important and good for mental health, that can be reduced. And that's important to reduce in sort of the trans population as well. And that can help sort of decrease those feelings of potential social isolation and alienation in male spaces, because there's less of a barrier to entrance in a way. So I propose that we should study male connection and loneliness and how it relates to gender diverse experiences. I think particularly in the US right now, because there is a barrier to studying gender diverse experiences and trans experiences right now, this could be a good way to sort of further that research without that specific subject matter in the meantime. And then I would also suggest education and support for trans-mask folks during social transition. Through my experience and the experience of those I've spoken to about this topic, that is, the biological aspects are certainly talked about medically as someone transitions and are counseled through. But I think the social aspects and sort of what that expectation is once someone is perceived in a different manner might not be as focused on. And I think that would be a good thing to talk about to prepare folks for. And then this last point is less empirical. I think it's important to help your loved ones advocate for themselves and their needs as they go through transitioning. Basically, like, now that you have this knowledge, sort of moving through and talking to the folks that you know, if they feel this way, and sort of how to move forward. Thank you.
All right. Apologies for the first slide. It looks like transferring it to the conference got a little bit distorted, but hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Sophia Ciavarella, and I'm a Master's of Social Work student here at UVic in my last semester. I'm a queer trans woman as well as an uninvited white settler. I approached my work from a background in multiple types of community care, including gender-based violence prevention, sex worker rights, harm reduction, and working with trans and gender diverse people. I am passionate about community care and knowledge generation by and for trans and gender diverse communities. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that the project this presentation is based on has spanned across the traditional territories of many Coast Salish First Nations in what is now colonially referred to as British Columbia. I respectfully acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples and the lands of the Songhees, Esquimalt, Wasanich, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples on whose land this research has been conducted on. Trans and gender diverse people express high rates of difficulty accessing safe, respectful, and relevant mental health care services. Prior studies of these experiences show that respondents disclose anything from unhelpful to outright discriminatory encounters. These can range from an unhelpful avoidance or overemphasis on gender identity, a lack of education or training that requires the client to take on the role of the educator, and most seriously, prejudice, pathologization, or visible discomfort on the part of providers. At the same time, many mental health providers report low levels of education and training on TGD people's unique care needs. One study of this issue found that at most 2 hours are spent in a graduate degree on TGD people's unique care needs, if any are spent at all. While there are many studies that document these problems, there are few studies that exist that explore how to actually address these problems, and fewer still that center trans and gender diverse people's own understandings and priorities in mental health care. To begin to fill this gap, the Transforming Supports Project, led by Maddie Walker, a PhD candidate at UVic, was created to invite trans and gender diverse young people to share their experiences accessing trauma-related mental health care. The project operated according to the principles of community-based research. The topic was chosen due to its direct impact on the well-being of TGD people accessing care. The project itself was informed by initial community consultations and guided by an advisory committee of trans and gender diverse people with experience in mental health care as either clients or providers. The criteria for participation was identifying as a trans or gender diverse person between the ages of 19 and 30 who had experience accessing or desiring access to trauma-related mental health care in British Columbia. Participants were recruited through digital and physical poster sharing through a diverse array of organizations, including university pride collectives, sexual health organizations, Indigenous-based organizations, and youth-serving organizations. 19 participants were eligible, and data was collected using semi-structured online interviews conducted between March and August 2023. Interviews followed trauma-informed principles. Participants were not asked about trauma or mental health symptoms that led to them seeking care, but rather solely on those care-seeking experiences themselves, and participants were offered the chance to debrief with a mental health provider after the interview. Intersectionality was employed as an analytical framework during both recruitment and analysis from the understanding that TGD experiences are multidimensional instead of monolithic, with each TGD person uniquely impacted by their relationship to overlapping systems of power that influence their care-seeking experiences. Data was also analyzed using thematic analysis. Interviews were transcribed and coded, and key themes were identified related to barriers to access, perceptions of safety, and research priorities. I entered this project as a practicum student during the knowledge translation phase and have primarily been assisting in knowledge translation activities, such as creating the resource that I've put on some of the tables and presentations such as this one. This presentation draws on the thematic analysis of the 19 interviews conducted by Maddie Walker to provide recommendations for mental health care practice. The name of this presentation is a quote from one of the participants. They explained that they were constantly working at finding someone that is competent in all of the pieces of who I am. Reading through the transcripts, so many participants had experiences where care providers only saw their own abstract idea of transness instead of a full person. It also made me reflect on how little I've learned about working with other TGD people throughout multiple degrees in care work. To me, the quote represents that TGD people's unmet care needs are not just a matter of bad individuals, but rather a broader problem where care providers are not being equipped to meet TGD people's care needs in their education and training. As such, the aim of this presentation is to provide recommendations for better and safer mental health care practices with TGD people. While designed with mental health providers in mind, such as counselors, social workers, and youth workers, many of these recommendations can be applied to any type of care work with TGD people. Unfortunately, many participants entered into a new therapeutic relationship carrying past negative experiences with providers. The vast majority of participants disclosed at least one negative past experience, ranging from misgendering to an outright denial of care, or even pressure to detransition. Previous research has found that negative service experiences lead directly to low client retention, with one study even finding that 50% of TGD clients stop accessing care after a negative experience. Indeed, several participants in this study expressed that negative initial experiences accessing care were large barriers to risking accessing care in the future. Even more seriously, some participants expressed that negative experiences served to compound the trauma or hurt that they were seeking care for, effectively worsening their overall mental health than if they had never sought support in the first place. One participant, when discussing their outlook on accessing new services, said, "I walk in expecting the worst possible outcomes because I know that if I have any hope of getting help, that's going to be worse when it doesn't happen." As a result of these experiences, TGD clients might be wary to trust a new provider or even be preparing themselves for the worst. As one participant put it, you never know if someone is going to be affirming of your gender or if they're going to tell you that you're what's wrong in the world. The following section will discuss how providers were able to build trust through collaboration and acknowledgement of lived experiences and managing mistakes. Possibly due to the negative experiences just described, participants expressed greater ease in a more collaborative relationship, where they felt empowered to seek boundaries and priorities in their care. One participant said that they appreciated when a provider asked them, "How do you want to co-create this space and the boundaries and safety?" Questions like these help them feel safe to disclose vulnerable experiences. A collaborative relationship can also serve as a counter-narrative to transphobia, allowing clients to express agency over themselves, who they are, and their experiences, when so much of transphobia involves stripping that away. When it came to advice and recommendations from their provider, most participants appreciated when this insight was couched in the experience or context that a provider was coming from. Multiple participants said they liked it when a counselor admitted they didn't know something, especially if it was related to a privileged identity. Many helping professions train providers to use self-disclosure with caution. However, this project has found that, when appropriate, self-disclosures of shared experiences or an acknowledgement of difference can go a long way towards building trust. One participant said that they would like more practitioners that easily and transparently share their lived experiences and also their limitations, providers that have actually thought about and worked with their access to power and privilege. Another component of building trust was how mistakes or accidental harm was handled. For many participants, trust was measured less by an absence of mistakes or accidental harm, but how those were addressed. When participants were misgendered or met with an ignorant comment, a quick acknowledgement, apology, and correction was most preferable. Participants expressed that they were not expecting perfection, but rather that seeing how their provider dealt with mistakes or accidental harm was itself a huge factor in the decision to disclose vulnerable experiences. Our next theme is on affirmation. Once trust has been established, TGD participants overwhelmingly expressed the need to feel supported by their provider. Accepting experiences with providers stood out to participants and were described as both meaningful and helpful. Experiencing intentional support and acceptance provided participants with a space where they felt affirmed as a person with legitimate needs who was taken seriously. As a result, energy spent on vigilance, self-advocacy, or resisting prejudice could be spent on healing instead. On this note, though, many BIPOC participants experienced further barriers to feeling supported by their provider. These participants expressed that they felt torn by cultural spaces where they didn't feel their gender identity was accepted, and TGD spaces where they didn't feel their culture or race were respected. According to one participant, you have to leave everything cultural at the door unless you're the dominant culture, or you don't get treated right as a trans person, but then you get to engage in culturally proper things. Experiences like this show that fragmented services are not equipped to care for TGD people's full selves. As we just talked about, negative experiences can discourage TGD people from risking future harm by seeking care again. If TGD people don't view mental health care as a place where they can be understood or the full spectrum of their needs can be met, the motivation to seek help decreases, and as a result, mental health care becomes inaccessible. Some of the steps towards better meeting TGD care needs that we've already covered include 1, supporting a collaborative relationship with TGD clients where they feel empowered to set boundaries and priorities in the therapeutic relationship. 2, reflecting on how providers' own identities and experiences influence their perspective. 3, being open to feedback. And 4, practicing intentional acceptance of TGD clients. There are also several more steps that providers can take to improve the experiences of TGD people accessing care. 5, TGD people's negative experiences accessing care can make initial appointments with new providers stressful. One way to alleviate this concern is for providers to ensure they are actively communicating their support. Explicitly sharing principles on websites can help prospective clients in choosing a provider to seek care from. Other small acts, such as asking for or sharing your own pronouns, leaving room on intake forms for chosen names, using gender-neutral or affirming language, and explicitly acknowledging the impact of transphobia, if brought up, could go a long way towards creating a space where TGD clients can feel safe disclosing vulnerable information. 6, and part of this, affirming TGD clients' identities is supporting the language used to describe themselves. Mirroring clients' language when talked about things like gender and identity can help providers communicate that they are listening to and respectful of lived experience. 7, understanding more about TGD people's care needs can help support providers in their ability to recognize and help these clients feel accepted. Training and education on TGD care needs should be incorporated into both university curricula and professional development programming so that learning can begin before encountering TGD clients. 8, providers can also engage in self-learning through critical reflection. Some important questions for anyone to ask can be what assumptions they might hold about gender or TGD people in general and where those beliefs originated from. By clarifying our perspectives on gender, providers can avoid unintentionally opposing these assumptions onto clients who understand their genders differently. 9, when accessing education and training on TGD care needs, it is important for providers not to develop a restrictive or one-size-fits-all approach. There is no singular TGD experience. For example, non-binary clients in particular might have totally different needs and experiences than trans men and women. 10, remembering the experiences of BIPOC participants who felt made to choose between their gender or race and culture, providers must understand that TGD people's experiences of racism, colonization, ableism, or other axes of oppression cannot be separated or left outside the room. As such, 11, this expansion on TGD care needs must be accompanied by learning on anti-racism and cultural safety, so BIPOC TGD people can receive care as their full selves. One way that white or settler providers can support this goal is by working with, supporting, and promoting Indigenous and other BIPOC-specific care organizations and providers where BIPOC TGD people are centered in mandate and programming. While all TGD spaces should always be accepting of all TGD people, BIPOC TGD people also deserve spaces where their needs are centered from the ground up. As hostility to our community sees a renewed escalation, it remains more vital than ever that we understand and work to resolve the barriers that trans and gender diverse people face accessing care. Thank you for listening, and I hope that together, as TGD people, researchers, care workers, and community members, we can work together to make sure that TGD people receive the respectful, safe, and relevant care that they deserve. Just quickly, this is my and Maddie's contact information if you'd like to learn more and the website of the project. A thank you to the community partners that made this research possible, and references if you want to know what the hell I'm talking about.